Hey, this is Scott Barron with School Growth, and boy, we love having conversations with educators that are involved. They're on the edge. I mean, they're really doing the research, and they're asking hard questions, and they're exploring. Where are we going? This is an exciting time, of course, because we're entering into the second quarter of the 21st century. Think about that. I mean, we're already there. If you reflect on that, what's happened in the education space over the last 25 years? It's been phenomenal. And there's certain people that have been a part of looking at that, reflecting on that, and trying to make sure that as we move into this next quarter century, that we're being very thoughtful, especially we're seeing that happening in the United States as we've seen a lot of innovation happening. We've seen a lot of experimentation. Some has worked and some hasn't. But that's the joy of trying things, of being innovative. And so really excited today to share with you Dr. Ashley Berner, who is the director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy. She's also an associate professor of education there at Johns Hopkins. And she's a great friend, but also she's an expert. And she's published articles and chapters and done all kinds of things around this question and this word that many of you may not be familiar with called pluralism, education pluralism. She has a previous book on pluralism in American public education, No One Way to School. And then she's got a new one coming out, having kind of processed and seen some of the impact and also seen some of the more recent research. And so now beginning to kind of explore what next, right? How do we create education systems that are able to really participate in an innovation economy that is requiring schools to step up to a whole new level post-COVID, post some of the other challenges that we've had. Now what? And so, Ashley, I'm so glad you're here, and we're really looking forward to this conversation.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for the invitation. Scott, I'm sure you would be those of you listening know that Scott's been on the foreground of the research to practice space of helping schools and school systems scale up excellence. So I really appreciate you, Scott, and really appreciate the chance to have this conversation.
Absolutely. So the book, and it's on pre-order. It's coming out soon, right? Next couple of weeks. It's on pre-order though. If you go to Amazon and you go to Educational Pluralism and Democracy. Just those 4 words, education, pluralism, and democracy. You can order it now, get your early copy. It will be worth it. I can promise you. I've read the book, the manuscript, and it's just got some powerful things that we're going to be talking about today and exploring, because it's something that this has to be a conversation that education leaders, educators at all levels throughout our systems, policymakers, and others. We've got to be thinking about these questions. These are critical things that require respectful dialogue, right? And that's, I think, a core part of your message that I picked up on in the book, Ashley, was that this is not about politics, right? This is really about thinking what's in the best interest of our society, of the democracy, of our culture, as well as our students.
So I agree with you. I think the kind of background to what I'm hoping to do with this book is to work in the pre-political space. Honestly, the philosophical and conceptual questions about what is public education? What is it for? Who should deliver it? All of those things are really, in essence, pre-political. And I'm hoping to pull them back into that space. And what we see in the landscape of education policy is a lot of combat, a lot of zero-sum game, competitiveness, even with our research. We weaponize our research. And we find, which is incredibly distressing, we find leaders attacking entire school sectors, on very disparaging terms. You have school choice folks talking about failing district schools. You have district leaders talking about how charters are robbing them. And it's a negative zero-sum game. Now, what is so striking as someone who looks at education systems around the world, is how unusual our dysfunction is. If you were to go to the Netherlands or England or Indonesia or, in many provinces in India, Canada, Australia, you don't find that negative kind of combat. Rather, you find a commitment to helping all different schools prosper and deliver excellence. And that is because their parameters, their framework, their conceptual framework is pluralistic. So I'm happy to unpack that term if you'd like, but it's a different world.
Want to do that. It is a different world. And your point about dysfunction is one that I don't want to lose, because as we've talked to educators at all levels, one of the things that the real concerning thing that we've discovered is that, of course, we're seeing a significant pressure on educators now, and we're seeing less coming into the market, coming into to be educators and answering the call, that noble calling, and we've seen many kind of going other career tracks, right? And over and over and over, what we're hearing is what they're really leaving is dysfunctional behavior and dysfunctional systems.
Yes.
Right. And so this idea of these behaviors that you're speaking about, this is not a trivial point. This is literally undermining the quality of education that the students in the United States are experiencing because of the adults in the room.
That's right. There's a lot of evidence that teachers are under pressure, particularly around this, which is kind of a subtext of my book, and in fact, it's in the subtitle, is this fear of exposure to diverse viewpoints that parents have. And I think if I were just to pull back for a second and say, how is it healthier in most systems? Because we have to have a comparison. So the vast majority of systems in the world have government funding for all different kinds of schools, whether they be religious or secular or politically oriented or identity focused, pedagogically focused, and then holding them all accountable for academic results. And so what that does, and these are terms that all of us understand, is they make it possible for schools to have distinctive cultures that are very clear, mission-driven, and that are different from one another. Because that human institutions are moral, they're ethical, they can't help it. That's not a bad thing. That's how it is. So you fund a lot of different kinds of ethos. But at the same time, the highest performing countries are saying, okay, and we're all going to learn similar content. So we get to have our own school values, our own community of values and ethics. And from that safety, as it were, we're going to insist on exposure to very many different kinds of views. And we know from the research that both of those things build strong democratic citizens.
Sure. Yeah, and there's of course that tension, right? Is what is an educated child? What is it? Is it a part of an indoctrination process? Who owns it? Is it the government's responsibility, or do parents own that responsibility? There are a lot of tensions that you identify in the book, and you're trying to kind of walk a fine line of a minefield. Right? Because everybody wants to blow up on things, and instead, what you're trying to do here is to say, hey, let's just back off for a second. Let's just have a conversation.
Yeah.
Like let's think about this as we move forward in American society. We've got some pretty good things going on. How do we not screw this up? Right? How do we do this in a way that enables? I was talking to a gentleman from Europe yesterday in a board retreat, and he said, when we came to the United States, it's incredible the opportunities that are here. That having traveled the world, this guy's been to hundreds of countries, and he said, I've never seen anything like it here, and we it's it's something that we need to leverage and make sure that let's don't screw this up. Let's create an ability to ask hard questions, but also to be able to find ways forward that are not politicized. But there's also not this dominant misinformation and even disinformation. And that was the fascinating thing that I loved about one of your points was, hey, tell the truth. Right? I mean, in the end, what we're asking you to do is let's look at this honestly, and let's don't allow our inclinations around politics or power or money or other structures, because it's very interesting to me watching some of these debates, how it has, on this one subject around education, it has caused some partnerships that are unusual.
What are you thinking of?
Well, so like in Texas, for example, in the resistance there around exploring different educational structures, you have some those that are very conservative, some other social topics,
right,
now partnering with teachers unions or others that they normally would have very adversarial relationships with, and they're actually becoming partners against some of the things that they feel would be a threat to our version of public education, which is a very interesting sort of partnerships.
Yes, but political alliances come and go. I think if we could get into the pre-political system and say, wait a minute, our existing system is not a taken for granted. It's not a given. It was designed in the mid 19th century to try to, for want of a better word, homogenize immigrants, particularly Catholic immigrants, into the majoritarian culture. Other countries didn't roll that way. Most other countries that developed education systems during the 19th and early 20th century remained pluralistic and required a high bar academically of all of them. And so I think there's a lot of fear, understandably, around change, because what we've known, this public versus private binary, is all we can imagine until we take a pause, as you're saying, step back and say, wait, doesn't, 171 out of the 204 countries that UNESCO tracks have public-private partnerships for educational delivery. So obviously there are a lot of different ways to do public education. It has to be democratically chosen at the state and local level. So in a state like Florida that has lots and lots of choice mechanisms, the rural schools, not to my knowledge, not one rural district school has closed, but rather what's happened is small groups of families that have access to the Florida mechanism of a tax credit have created micro schools around things like certain special needs, certain learning needs, certain identity focal points. And so it hasn't threatened the district schools, but I can understand why rural leaders are concerned. It's not something we've experienced before.
Sure. So do you feel like this book could be a catalyst for more productive debate and decisions regarding U.S. education, systems with regionally, state level and national?
I hope so. I think it's definitely, from what I've seen in the states that I've worked with, it's a state by state. It's a state by state question. There are some states that are very open to a new way of discussion, and in some of those states, there's an appeal to kind of putting down the weapons at this point and saying, how do we help all of our schools be the best version of themselves?
Well, it's like you said earlier, it's a focus not on my little microcosm here and maybe my community or my state or my region, but it's looking at the greater whole. And I think that's the key point that comes out of the study of other education systems around the world, is that they're willing to kind of step back and look at that greater good. And that's a powerful, there's a freedom in that, I think, both individually as well as a country, so that we are able to create some common sense that could come out of that, right? And hopefully some greater unity. And if anything that we would love to have in the United States today, it might be just some level of unity together. I
That's
think that
exactly right.
could be a beautiful thing.
That's exactly right. And a real respect for one another's belief systems and right to disagree. But I would say, Scott, as you know, these are learned behaviors. We don't spring from our mother's womb knowing how to articulate our own views and hold the views of someone else with respect. We have to practice this.
It does take practice. You're right.
It takes practice, and our educators need practice with it, and they need administrative support, right? I think about all the educators you're working with. You know, there are some schools and school systems that have done a fantastic job of saying, guess what? Your kids are going to encounter beliefs and views that you don't agree with, but that's part of being an educated person.
You bet. Absolutely.
You know, and I think the fact that we're not used to having those deep, rich conversations in our classrooms makes it harder to get there, but not impossible.
That's right. Well, and of course, part of what we get a chance to do in our work with school growth is to help schools begin to think about culture in a genuine way. There's a lot of talking about culture, but truly transforming culture. One of the points you make in the book is, culture is about your beliefs and your habits, right? It's about those things that you create, and they're at some level they have to be non-negotiables, right? Because what we've learned about culture, especially within the school setting, is culture is what you tolerate. Right?
And that's right. And writ large, culture is often what you inherit. So this public culture is, to some extent, the things that were once contested and fought about that are now just part of the background. And I would put
you don't know what came from.
Yeah,
right? I mean, that's the interesting thing that I learned from your book is there's so many assumptions. It's like, oh, wait. Yeah, that's not, where did that come from? Right. And so that's, I guess, part of establishing a healthy culture and even healthy dialogue, even school improvement plans is, hey, know where you are and how you got there. That's I think, what you've done in this book is to say, hey, wait a second, time out, right? Where we are was actually, there's a whole history behind that. And I'd never seen it sort of consolidated in your first book, captured even more of this, right? Is that all that sort of foundational pattern, all this, the timeline of, and don't forget, everything we have today, that was because of decisions that were made 100 years ago, or
more,
less, right? Or more, right? But these are assumptions that we have, and if we're going to grow forward, it's a healthy process to look at that honestly. Where are we? Where are we? And how did we get here? What were the underlying decisions? And are the hypotheses that drove those decisions still true? Right? Is that where we want to land? And so that has to happen at the micro level within the schools, and that's what we get a chance to do is guide schools through that journey of figuring out, what is the culture that we need going forward, and honestly facing the brutal facts of, our culture is all over the place, right? Person to person, classroom to classroom, day to day. If you're going to create the best environment for educators and students to thrive, predictability is a vital part of that.
That's right.
That's culture. Well, so here's the question for you then. As you talk about this idea of culture change. I love your line there that there is nothing inevitable about culture change, right?
Right.
And it's true. It only happens through intent. And we've seen schools that have beautifully written core values,
right,
but they're meaningless.
That's right.
Because there's no teaching, there's no accountability to them. And of course, if you don't have accountability to your core values, you really don't have core values, right? It's just wall decoration.
That's right.
So how do you suppose or even propose that the culture around the U.S. education system might be moved to a level that supports healthy dialogue and more productive outcomes across the divides?
Well, that's a really big question. And there's not just one answer to it. And I guess I want to unpack the question of culture on two levels. On the one hand, there's the school level culture of an individual school having a clear mission and values that play out in its practices. And that is not something that can ever be taken for granted. Even strong school cultures can lose their way, can need to be revisited, right? So this needs to be nurtured and supported by the school leaders, the families, and so forth, and policy at the policy level to make distinctive school cultures possible. So, I feel like I work on both levels, as do you. On the one hand, trying to help every single school articulate its mission, become clearer about that, and translating them into practices. That's one level of culture and should be distinctive. And then more broadly, the policy world, the policy debates, how can we shift the culture from this binary of public versus private into one that says there's room for everyone? There's room for everyone. Just look at the Netherlands. They fund 36 different kinds of schools, and all of them are held accountable for academic results. It doesn't have to be this binary. How do we shift that into a more productive place? I think, the jury's still out, but it will take time, and it will take actual concrete on the ground policies. Where we have certain places like Washington, D.C. that are 50% charter. That was once contested, but now it's taken for granted. At the same time, a lot of young families don't know whether they're applying to a charter or a district school because it's just part of that. I can imagine that if we continue to have meaningful differentiation of delivery through different mechanisms of charter schools and tax credits and so forth, that eventually the next generation will experience things differently. But I'm not someone, when you ask, how can we hold each other accountable for excellence? I don't think it's just culture. I think it has to do with an academic rigor. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book. The first book, I focused exclusively on the structure of education. And this book, I really home in on some of the strong research that suggests that a liberal arts education, and by that I simply just mean rigorous, subject-specific content mastery, that piece is the key lever that, again, any school, any system can pull to good effect. But, and there's a whole story behind that, as you know, like we used to be liberal arts oriented. We used to democratize the liberal arts, and it really works for first generation low income families. And to your point about creating kind of, capacity to hold diverse viewpoints at scale, we are talking about a common content, not a common curriculum, but common reference points. That creates a democratic speech community. And yet it is hard to move from where we are to there.
Well, and that's part of the reason why we've advocated the idea of, hey, if you're going to lead a school, the calling to lead a school is to love and lead educators, right? If you can build an incredible team of talented educators, partner them up with a curriculum that is authentic, right? Is authentically excellent, and then create a culture in which those educators can thrive, you will change kids' lives.
And you'll change the educators' lives because that's what they want.
You'll change the educators'
lives.
That's
what they need.
Absolutely.
That kind of, there's some substantial evidence that teachers really want great working culture environments and really clear support on high quality curriculum. And many different school systems are starting to pull that lever. And again, it's school sector agnostic.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So then if you think about sort of the best techniques for negotiations, right? Because what I learned in school leadership in my years was, man, a vast majority of the job is negotiations. You're negotiating with students, with faculty, with parents, with donors, with whatever, right? And the best way to do that is to establish shared values. Right?
Mhm.
What do we agree on together? So my question
Mhm.
for you then is, what are the shared values around which we might negotiate some of these critical issues regarding education?
Well, this is a very good question, Scott. And I mean, my instinct would say shared value is that education is a common good, that we are all in it together, and that is our collective responsibility to make sure that the next generation has the knowledge, the skills, and the dispositions to take advantage of American opportunity and also to share in the democratic project. And that's where I think many of us are concerned, that we are not giving the core knowledge. And this is apropos to schools in every sector. Some district schools do this really well. Some district schools do not. Some religious private schools do this beautifully. Others do not. And it's, and really helping leaders know the difference. And I think, again, to your kind of question about how does a leader do this at a school level, it is about, like you said, shared values, explaining why the curriculum is the way it is, and giving teachers the tools to teach it, and being very clear with the parents that this is what the project is all about. Now, we are at a disadvantage, and this is where I keep wanting to compare with how historically plural countries have an advantage. And I'll just give back to the example of the Netherlands, but the same is true in many places. The Netherlands funds all different kinds of schools, including creationist schools. They fund them outright. But every child in a creationist school has to demonstrate competent knowledge of evolutionary theory at some point in secondary school. They don't have to believe it's true, but they have to know what it is.
Still develop an intelligent faith.
Absolutely. And to understand what different viewpoints are. The same with comparative religion and ethics. There are parents in the United States who are afraid that when a teacher gives knowledge about the Quran or the 5 pillars of Islam, that's indoctrinatory. Whereas in Europe, you may go to a Jewish day school or a Catholic school, but you still have to learn what Islam teaches. And that's the kind of really challenging piece for Americans, which is that exposure doesn't necessarily mean indoctrination. That helpful distinction between indoctrination, really inculcation of values, it happens all the time in every human institution. Let's just make it clear. That lives in the ethos of the school. But the exposure piece happens through a rigorous curriculum. And it can be interpreted through the lens of the school. So there's a difference between a child knowing about something and believing it to be true.
Sure. But that also has to be contrasted with another key point that you made in your book, is that education cannot be and isn't neutral with respect to values.
That's exactly right.
And every time we create a disciplinary code, we select a curriculum and design parent-teacher protocols, right?
Exactly.
Reinforce values. There's no way that you can say, well, we're not really teaching those values, or we're even agnostic around values.
You can't be. And that's not nefarious. That is just the way human behavior.
I mean, it can be demonized if you want it to be.
Yeah, but
we can kind of come at this intellectually,
right,
and just think it through, right?
And just say, look, it's not a bad thing. It's inevitable that every human enterprise rests on certain values, even if they're very thin, even if they're simply, you got to get ahead in life, or I want every kid to go off to college, whatever it is, or it can be as robust as the, Catholic theology, if you will. But it's going to reinforce ethics in some fashion. So instead of pretending otherwise, let's just fund a variety of ethical systems. different
Well, and what we've
ethics.
cautioned what's been interesting to me is as we've welcomed educators internationally, like from Australia or from India or other countries, Korea and China, uh, as they visited the United States and visited schools, they have been a bit taken aback by some of the things that we debate, the things that we get lost in.
Such as
And so I
what? What
think
is really what surprises them the most?
I think it's the way that we demonize some of the other views of the world, and that we've kind of figured we have all the answers, we figured it out, and it's just that everybody else is too stupid to figure it out themselves, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a confrontational approach that I think that they're a bit surprised that's just not a part of their culture and their dialogues at all, right? Like
Right.
even the idea of a public versus private, or I know that we visited several schools where they were using some of the United States Common Core. Yes, and unfortunately, and sometimes in the U.S., there was so much disinformation and misinformation spread about Common Core that was, I mean, just to be honest, it was a lie, and
That's exactly right.
it was a lie of convenience because it was shared as a part of really a marketing strategy to try to illustrate why we're not as we're better than them, and we're right, and so it was a part of an effort to try to. Honestly, it was a complete disinformation campaign
I agree.
around things that were just learning standards. Have you ever read them?
That's right. They're
Give me a break,
banal. They're
right?
pretty banal. And in fact,
Yes.
the biggest untruth too was that they were foisted on the United States by the federal government when really they were developed by the National Governors Association and passed by state legislatures. But you're right. It's a lot of wasted energy.
Yeah,
What,
so I guess I do love the idea of what you're proposing. Of course, is we do have to be willing to tell the truth, but there has to be some leadership, and
yeah.
I think that's one of the things that the United States struggles with the most right now is a dearth of really genuine and
Mhm.
authentic leadership.
That's really well
Absent
said.
absent from the politics of it all and the control of it all, we're in trouble. I mean, and as the leading of democracy and of the world, I think that we really are in serious problems right now. Education is one of the areas that we've continued to allow an infection of dysfunction.
Yeah.
And unless we genuinely are able to get outside of our own sort of power struggles and our own inclinations, then and really think honestly and respectfully, and I would be I'd say in love,
In
right?
love,
Not
right.
because to my faith-based brethren out there, when you demonize, when you've already convicted your mission field, you've already lost. Right?
It's
You've already
sobering.
lost your credibility of your influence and of your calling when you do that. And so part of this is I think when I read your book, I read it as a call to action. It is a
Hmm.
call to, hey, we've got to get outside of ourselves. This is for our children. This is for our grandchildren. This is for our country, right?
Hmm.
We do have to figure out. We got to be able to make a case around this, but it's not going to happen unless we can have intellectual conversations that are respectful, that are kind, right? And
Hmm.
we may come to different conclusions from looking at the same data. That's okay.
That's
But
okay.
eventually we have to make some decisions that are in the greater good. And that's, I think, is the ultimate right message around this, as you advocate for, is
Hmm.
yeah, but right.
Hmm.
Remember the calling here. Remember what we're
Hmm.
supposed to be doing as educators. This
Hmm.
is the noblest of callings, to
It
change
is.
somebody else's life.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? What else?
Mhm.
What else could you do that would have greater impact than to be an educator? And I love this work, and I love calling
Mhm.
others into it because of the life changing impact that it has. But we've got to figure out a way to get kind of past our past
Yes,
and find ways of collaborating at different levels.
I agree. And I think kids are hungry for this. With the many, many different school systems that we've worked with across the country, we hear quite often from young people, they want more rigorous, more honest, more caring adults around them in their schools. And this is a crisis of leadership. Our school leaders need to give teachers the tools they need to do this really well. And since we have had 100 years of not just the public-private binary, but also a process-based education where we're not really inculcating depth of knowledge about places and things and people and ideas, we have to give educators a lot of support with the content as well. And this is the real work, and it's hard and it's long-term, but it will change lives.
It's worth it. Right?
It's worth it.
Right. And because we're pursuing wisdom, not just
right.
not just
But
knowledge.
I think I'm going to just come back to something that you said that I think is really important about being able to to back away from our own emotions enough just to create a welcoming, hospitable place for disagreement. And that requires epistemological humility. It requires the ability to say, I don't know everything. There may be something I can learn. Listen, I will tell you from my own life. I was not raised a Marxist. I am not a Marxist. But in college, I read everything that Karl Marx wrote, much of it in German, because that was the going theory when I was in college. And I wanted to understand it. And I ended up deeply disagreeing with Marx's understanding of the human person. But I know what he was trying to do. And I can have sympathy with someone who believes these certain things about the world, even if I vehemently disagree. But that should be sort of the willingness that we all have. But I had parents who were not afraid of diverse ideas. I had parents who were not protectionist in that way. They had strong beliefs. We talked about that. I shared them, but they were unafraid in the world.
Wow. So last question for you. What did you learn? I mean, you went into this with a certain sort of way of thinking about things, certain hypotheses. What did you learn from this research?
What I struggled with the most is the question of how to balance the obligations of the state and individual schools and school systems that are different in meaningful ways with which I'm not sympathetic. I don't think I had realized the extent to which pluralism requires us to accept other kinds of schools and theories that we just don't like. And as long as I've been in this field, it was really important and hard to come to, what are the kinds of schools that I would instinctively roll my eyes at? And, those kinds of things. So just, I guess, surprised me of how difficult that really is at the personal level. And
so it goes back to that humility.
Yes, right? Yes.
And what's interesting about humility is it's similar to wisdom, right? The closer you get to it, the further you get from it.
Yes, that's a really good way to put it.
The more humble, the more humility that you learn, of course, those go hand in hand, because the more that you gain, the more knowledge. If you're really a wise educator, you realize all the things you don't know. And it creates even more gaps, right? And that's the exciting thing about it, is there's always something more. And it's also the humbling part of it is you don't even know what you don't know.
That's right.
And the best educators.
That's the scary thing. That's the thing that used to get me when I was up in front of a class, like, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? And I think it is always worth asking ourselves that question. What am I not seeing in this conversation? Whom am I not recognizing in this room? What are my own blind spots?
Well, that's what I've liked about your research and even in our dialogue together, is you run up against some in higher ed who really think they have all the answers, right? And they're actually paid to be the smartest person in the room. And I think you've maintained a humility in your journey, and I love that about you and what you've done
Well,
there.
I hope so.
There at
That's
the
a real
Institute. So,
compliment. Thank you.
yeah,
May it be so.
it's hard to do.
We're not
It's
there
very hard
yet.
to
I'm
do.
certainly
Yeah,
not there yet, but that's what I
right.
aim to do.
Yeah, for sure.
It's
I like to describe higher ed as a collection of anarchists connected by a hallway. Right? I mean, they're just
that's
they're all running their own kind of program, and
yeah.
it's hard to build culture in higher ed and in any
Yes.
institution.
Yes.
But well, listen, actually, very thankful for what you're doing there, and admire
Thank you.
your persistence in the research. And I mean, you are fighting against a lot of things that people want to try to politicize and put a lot of energy around things that, if we just kind of pause for a second, all we're asking, as you're reading this material and as you're thinking about these things, just
Hmm.
pause for a second.
That's right.
Just remember that there is a greater good here. We don't have all the answers. Have enough humility to kind of
Hmm.
face that reality. And then as a country, let's see if we can kind of come together for the benefit. I mean, if you just do it for the kids, if you do it
That's right.
also for the educators, that's what we're advocating for. Is we can't keep treating our educators as disposable assets.
That's
The
100%
greatest
right.
assets of a school are not on the balance sheet. They're off balance sheet assets. It's the people. It's
It's the people.
consistently the people. So we just want to advocate for that a little bit as a part of this conversation together. And so remember the book is available. It's on
You
Amazon.
can
Uh,
order it
Get it
now.
now, get it now, get it
Yes.
now. Education, Pluralism, and Democracy. How to Handle Indoctrination, Promote Exposure, and Rebuild America's Schools. Hey,
Thank
Ashley,
you
thank you
so
for your dedication to
much.
the work. Really